Hello YouTube, welcome back. I'm visiting Eureka at the moment and walking down around the properties in this Vista Eureka development that was formerly a very large macadamia farm, and we've been here a few times. It kept the facade of a macadamia farm, but the signs of ex-tropical cyclone Alfred are around. There's a few whole trees that have been lost, and you'd wonder whether that might be a bit of a danger in farms where you do that removal of rows in between existing rows. When you leave tall trees relatively exposed, they can fall over or lean, as you can see in the picture there. That doesn't make it a bad idea to remove rows and give the trees some space. It's just that before they really grow out and get more solid, you've got a chance of losing them entirely, as you can see with that one in front of you now. So how's Vista Eureka going? Well, the whole experiment of buying up a very large macadamia farm, turning it into community title and selling off lots, well, there's no houses built. I saw 2 sold signs as I was driving around here out of about 13, 14 lots. So the idea of destroying macadamia farms and looking for quick profit in real estate works only if people buy it, and there's no real sign of people buying these things. All I'd say is, if you're considering buying a community title lot, go see a real property lawyer. Don't do it with a conveyancer. Get some advice on what community title actually means for you. And look, in that advice applies generally to buying a macadamia farm anyway. Go to an actual property lawyer who deals in farms. They can give you advice that will be very valuable to you. And that's certainly what I did when buying Nutkin Farm. Now, I'm feeling guilty, guys. Why am I feeling guilty? Because at the end of every year, I generally do a macadamia baby parade showing you the varieties of macadamia I experiment with, including a couple that are way out of the box that nobody else is growing. And last year, I didn't get around to it. Look, at that stage, the weather and other work-life commitments conspired, and those babies basically got swallowed up in the grass. They're still there. They're still probably doing really well. But assessing them and comparing them with each other, probably a little bit unfair. So I'm going to give that baby parade a miss for 2024. Come back to you better than ever in 2025, and hopefully we'll see a really good update on how my young macadamia varieties are doing, including their ability to crop. And look, as I go through autumn and winter, you'll certainly see some of my babies as we go. What I am doing instead is, thanks to the AMS coming out with some data from mapping a lot of the macadamia plantations around Australia, they have come up with a list of the most grown macadamia varieties in Australia. And this might be of interest, not just within Australia, but also around the world, and people wanting to grow macadamias in other countries. I keep getting inquiries from India. Sorry guys, I can't send you macadamia trees. I can't give you specific advice on growing in your area. You need consultants for those sorts of things. And I don't know who supplies macadamia trees in India. All I can say is that the Australian Macadamia Society's marketing efforts seem to be encouraging an industry rather than a purchase of nuts. But anyway, leave that to one side. This data is a little bit limited because most of the mapping has been done so far in the Bundaberg area. But the Bundaberg area, which is in Queensland, caters for about 50% of Australia's crop. And so it's not a bad picture, I guess, of what is grown. I just want to say that for the benefit of New South Wales farmers, because the varieties we grow here are in general a little bit different from what's grown in Bundaberg, and you'll probably wonder why some of your favourite varieties aren't showing up here. But bear in mind that the data is improving. the mapping is improving, and they're trying to get down to just block level mapping even within farms, and getting some stats on who's growing what and how productive it is. And that's going to be excellent data when we analyse the industry going forward. So we have the 8 most planted cultivars, and I'm going to start from 8 and move up to number 1, give you some brief commentary on what each of those varieties are like. Coming in at number 8 is the 842. Now, these varieties are numbered, these old Hawaiian varieties are numbered by the order in which they were developed, not necessarily released to farmers, but developed by the Hawaiian Agricultural Experiment Station, because Hawaii was the first to commercialise the macadamia nut, and they had a very big breeding program that released lots of varieties. And unlike the way Australia releases varieties, their testing was much more limited, and they threw varieties out into the market to let basically the market test them to see how good they were, rather than keep testing them repeatedly, which is what Australia is doing. The 842, the 800s, if you like, were some of the last varieties done in Hawaii before the Australian industry really took over and swamped it in terms of volume. And the 842, it's funny, it's a little bit of a Goldilocks. It's not particularly good at anything, but it's not particularly bad at anything either. Its features are, in general, that it has a lot of crop, and they're fairly small nuts that drop late. And that's okay, if you have a late dropping orchard, or if you want an orchard that partly drops some nuts late in order to spread your risk, that's fine. The kernel recovery can be sometimes around 40%. The shell, not too thick or thin. The husk, not too thick or thin. There's some stick tights. The tree doesn't grow overly large, which is a plus. It's you wouldn't call it a dwarfing tree either. It's just sort of mediocre in lots of good ways. But in Queensland, it does tend to bear fairly heavy crops of fairly small nuts. And is it reliable? I mean, from what I'm hearing, yes, it's sort of dependable as a variety. So that's not a bad thing. Number 7, the 344. Now, that's one of the earliest Hawaiian varieties. It's also well known in New South Wales because it was one of the main varieties planted here, partly because it was a strong tree that might resist a bit of cyclone damage, but my 344s would tend to put a lie to that, because they've probably suffered more than any other tree in my orchard. The 344, look, particularly when young, has a really decent heavy crop. There's a reasonably thick husk and a reasonably thick shell, giving the nuts some protection, but obviously lowering the kernel recovery a bit. Treated well, the 344 can crop very heavily. Once it gets challenged for light access, it can behave very poorly and produce crops perhaps every second year heavily, but not every single year, unless you're really nuking it with food. The problem with light access is because the 344 is a very big tree, and unless you plant them on very wide row spacings, you're going to run into trouble by the time they're about 20 years old. And look, you can prune them, but they resent pruning and have a bit of a sulk on you, so you can lose some crop while you're trying to keep the tree within reasonable height. Would I plant it these days? No, absolutely not. The 842, I'd say maybe, but not the 344. Okay, so number 6, the A16. This one's an Australian variety, came out in the 80s, one of the very first varieties to get plant variety rights from Hidden Valley plantations. A16 is, relatively speaking, a small tree. It gets very heavy crops of nuts if you treat it well, and it must be heavily fed in order to treat it well. And it has a lot of disadvantages. Look, it's thin-skinned. It can get a high kernel recovery, up over 40% kernel compared to shell. It drops its nuts late, some cases very late. And It has stick tights in that the tree sometimes wants to hang on to its nuts and not drop them for you. It got a little bit of a revival in Queensland, I'm told, when the practice of tree shaking got started a few years ago. It never really took off, tree shaking. The idea is, you can get the stick tights down by giving the tree a good firm shake and bring down the nuts. But yeah, it's got susceptibility to husk spot. It's got, it has, quite a few problems in terms of rejuvenating foliage and getting a decent level of crop on a continuing basis. Would I plant it today? No, I wouldn't. But it is, to give it its credit, potentially a very heavy cropper if it's very heavily fed. Number 5, MCT1. Now, that's a newer Australian variety, even though it's been in development since the 90s. It was tested and tested and tested up in Queensland in particular, where it was developed. And it is now, despite being very new on the scene, already number 5 in the list of our planted trees. The fact it's number 5 already shows how popular it is with new plantings. And from what I'm seeing, and certainly from what I'm hearing, of the new varieties released in Australia, it is by far and away the most popular, with some good reason. It has a heritage that sort of goes back to the A16 and A4, but is bred in with other tetraphylla varieties and integrifolia varieties, and that has given it a habit where it has nice big nuts, reasonably thin shell, bit of a thin husk, although there's some argument about that. Very heavy cropper. Again, needs to be heavily fed. Inputs, lead to outputs, and the MCT1 can't produce the heavy crops it's capable of unless you feed it well. It's not an overly large tree, which is another plus, because we don't want them growing out of control. And its yields start very early. Like the A16, it can yield within about 3 years, and in some cases even less, and start cropping and giving you a return on your investment very early. And it doesn't have a whole lot of disease susceptibility either. There's some, argument about potential husk spot, but I haven't really seen much evidence of that. And look, all in all, a very worthy variety, and there's a reason it's already number 5, despite just being a few years old. Would I grow it? Yes. That's one I definitely would grow. It's a little bit on the late dropping side as well, so, have a think about if you're planting it within an existing orchard of early dropping varieties. Planting a bunch of MCT1 means that you'll have a later harvest run as well, and that can have some efficiency issues if you're trying to mix it in. But if you're migrating to a later dropping crop anyway within an orchard, or you're planting a new orchard from scratch, later dropping is probably where you want to be looking at, particularly given the weather conditions we are being dished up every autumn these days. 816 is number 4. The 816, again, one of the later Hawaiian varieties. Its standout feature is it's one of the nicest tasting macadamia nuts. It can also be very prolific. It's not super precocious, but it'll give you a crop within 4 or 5 years. It's also potentially a very big tree, a very vigorous tree. It's got one real Achilles heel, and that is its root system. For some reason, no matter what you graft it on, the root system can be fairly weak, and it's very disease susceptible to Phytophthora, which is quite a problem in some macadamia growing districts. And so what people found with the 816 is that after about 10 years, they'd go like crazy, and then they'd start developing weakness and start becoming weak trees instead of strong trees, and the crop would fall right off. Now, whether that's Phytophthora or just some constitutional problem with the tree, not really sure. But there was a rash of planting 816s because they had very nice big nuts, pretty high kernel recovery as well. You could get upwards of 43% kernel on them, and you could get nice big crops. So the short-term lure was there. In the long term, I don't know whether pruning can help. I don't know, how you can maintain a high level of crop with the 816 reliably. I'm sure there are farmers in Queensland who do it. Would I plant it myself? No. Too much of a prima donna, and I don't want the maintenance down the track. Number 3, Dadau. Now, of all the varieties in this list, Dadau is one I know the least about. It's an old Queensland variety. I know that it's tough, it's very bushy, it has a very dense canopy, and on that level the tree is sort of fairly indestructible, and it's been used as a breeding platform. I think it's a component of the new macadamia variety G. So if you wanted to grow something with Dadau in it, it's possibly better to pick the new variety that has Dadau as a parent rather than Dadau itself. Capable of very big crops. Reliability, not so much. It doesn't crop well every year by reputation. Nothing overly special about the nut size, kernel recovery or anything else. It's like I said, it's an old Australian variety. It is probably worth growing in some parts of Queensland where you need the robustness of that kind of tree. Otherwise, would I grow it in New South Wales? No, I wouldn't. I think it's very interesting historically, but I wouldn't grow it now. Number 2, A203. And wouldn't Hidden Valley be crying into their beer? This was an Australian developed variety, and when it came out, my understanding was that Hidden Valley, who were a bit disillusioned with the whole plant variety rights process, tried to control it and earn their money from it by doing specific agreements with nurseries that they trusted to pay royalties on that variety. And look, that works for about the first generation. The problem is that the people you sell it to, the farmers you sell it to, aren't under any real restrictions because there's no registered intellectual property in them. And the A203 quickly became effectively a public domain variety that probably didn't reward its inventor very well. And in fact, they themselves didn't regard the A203 as a particularly good variety. The industry thought otherwise. It performs well, it crops early, it drops reasonably early, it has very, very large nuts with a reasonably thick shell, quite precocious, quite a nice habit of tree, quite a nice style of tree, and flowers like crazy in the spring, like a lot of the A varieties do. And just, it's proven itself over time as being a reliable, heavy cropper, and something that works well, probably in amongst the other early dropping varieties that are grown in Queensland, because the A203 itself does drop, not super early, but early enough to be compatible with other varieties. And because it doesn't grow overly large as a tree, you don't run into real sort of pruning speed humps down the track. Would I grow the A203? Look, I would. I think in New South Wales it's got a place as well. It's got a real, vigorous nature, and it's reasonably husk spot resistant as well. So if you're trying to create a low spray orchard, it's possibly one of the ones that'll suit you. And with that thick shell, it is a little bit more resistant to some pests than others are. So yeah, it's number 2, and no one saw that coming, particularly its creator. Number 1, and by quite a large margin, is the 741. 741 was quite an old variety from Hawaii. Its big feature really is that it's a very robust tree. It has a strong central leader. It is very vigorous. It's not a super early cropper by any means, but when it does get going, it'll provide you with tons and tons of reasonably small nuts. Now the kernel recovery's okay-ish, can be high 30s, even as high as 40 in some sort of instances, but you know, really it's quite a small nut, but born in very large amounts, so it's a heavy duty cropper. It's got some disadvantages though, and ones that in my opinion would have me not plant that variety. One is it's quite vulnerable to heat stress. I don't know why, and I don't know how that's been measured against other varieties, whether it's sort of relatively more susceptible. The other is that it's a very big tree. Again, you know, it's something that can rapidly grow out of control in the wrong soils, and in fertile soils like the Northern Rivers. The 741 it just wants to reach for the stars, and it's not really what you need when it comes to keeping trees under control. And like a lot of the other Hawaiian varieties, it resents pruning. So once you do have to prune the 741, you get a little bit of a holiday on production from it, and you end up with, obviously, you know, a less average crop over the long term, even though when it is cropping at full pelt, you're going to get a lot of nuts. Its other disadvantage, other than the size of the nuts, and you know, we are looking for bigger nuts these days because that does give an impression of quality to some of our target markets, and China in particular. The other disadvantage is that when you crack them out, the whole kernel percentage is very low. It's about 1/3. And again, you know, when it comes to the cosmetics of macadamia nuts, people like to eat whole nuts. That's understandable. They're the nicest experience to eat. They're certainly the best looking, and they give the impression of quality. Some of that's a little bit of an illusion, of course, and there's room for all kinds of macadamias in the industry, including chips and crumbs, but the highest prices come from the big whole kernel varieties. And actually, out of all the ones in the top 8, your best whole kernel is likely to come from MCT1 in particular. But and I'm not quite sure about any of the others, but whole big kernels seem to be the way the industry is going in terms of what people want the most. And 741 gives you small, fairly broken kernels when they come out of the shell. I know it's a big cropper, I know there's lots of tons, but if we move more into an era where nut processors are going to discriminate based on you know, the prices that they give you for certain kinds of nut, you won't be all that well equipped if you're offering them up 741s. It wouldn't be a processor's favourite nut, put it that way. And just my gut instinct is, well, you grow for the market, and you probably don't want what the market wants least. Having said that, it is, according to this AMS data, the most planted macadamia in Australia. Now, those of you in New South Wales will be going, well, what about the 849 and what about the 246 and all these other stalwart varieties that are grown in New South Wales, and even the A4. Look, these are, if you separated out New South Wales, these varieties would make the list, and they have plenty of merit. We're just talking here really at the moment. I mean, I'll update this as the AMS updates their data, because I think that list of top 8 will change. But if you're not growing any of these top 8 varieties, I wouldn't be worried at all. I mean, I grow the 344, the A16, the MCT1. That's all I grow. Oh, and a couple of 842s. So I grow 4 out of the top 8, but not in any, you know, particular numbers. And it's not a guide for what you should be planting today. Really, I think, you know, you look at that as reflecting a little bit of history rather than where you necessarily need to be going with your new plantings. What would I plant nowadays if I was planting? Well, I still am a fan of macadamia variety R. The new varieties introduced by Hort Innovation have been very unpopular relative to the MCT1, which was bred by Ian McConaughey privately and done the old school way, and the old school way turned out to be very, very good. But I still do like the macadamia variety R, and The exciting news is that Regional Variety Trials Series 4, there've only been 4 of them, where they're trying elite varieties for release into the Australian market. They're down to the last 25 elite varieties in their tens of thousands of seedlings test that they've been doing over the last few years. And while we're not likely to get any commercially released varieties from that trial for another few years yet, they have to really select the finals, and you'll hear a lot about them, but you won't actually get to plant them in your orchard for a few years. So I wouldn't hold off planting now, but some of those new varieties where they're focusing on high yields from a small tree look really exciting. And so it's something where if you're making plans to rejuvenate an orchard or something where you don't need to plant right now, by all means keep these new varieties in mind, because they may be particularly special. How about the rest of the world? Can you access these varieties overseas? Well, the MCT1 has been taken overseas. It's now available in South Africa. I don't know the status of varieties G, J, P and R, and whether or not they've been licensed overseas. It's possible. There are, of course, macadamia varieties in other countries that are still being developed. Apparently Brazil is working on their own one. South Africa has a few already, and there may be other local ones pop up from breeding programs overseas. Australia still seems to have the biggest breeding program, and obviously we're breeding for Australian conditions. But it was the same as the Hawaiians when they bred for their conditions as well. You know, we tested a lot of them here in Australia, and most of them were no good for our climate, despite being an Australian native species. There's just that many traits that have to be narrowed down to a perfect range. And whether or not our new inventions do well in the rest of the world, look, pot luck. If they work, they work. If they don't, I guess it's up to the individual countries to make something that works for them. So there's my summary of the most grown macadamia varieties in Australia. I'd love to hear from people, particularly from the Bundaberg region. What are your favourites out of those top 8? Because it's largely your region that's involved here. Am I a bit harsh on 741? I know it's the most popular. I'm probably going to invite some criticism for criticising the most popular variety. But is it worth is it worth planting nowadays? Would you plant a new block of 741s, or are you looking towards something else? Let us know in the comments, share your wisdom, and we will all be richer for it. Thanks for watching, guys. I'm going to catch you again soon. Bye for now.